Buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the Energy and Geostrategy 2022 presentation. For those of you who are here face-to-face, but for those of you who are online, according to the figures I've got, there are more than 300 people that have joined us. Energy and Geostrategy, or in Geo, for all of us who know it, has become a reference for everyone in the energy and defense world. And we're going to have two sections, an opening session where we'll have the chairman of Repsol, Mr. Brufau, also the chairman of the Spanish Committee of the Energy World Council, Iñigo Díaz de Espada, the chairwoman of the Spanish Club of Energy, María, Zingoni, and then we also have from the Defense Ministry, Juan Francisco Martínez Núñez. Then we'll have the General Dacoba talking to us. We'll talk about world geopolitics, and then the second part of the session will be headed by Claudio Aranzadi, Head of Communication, together with the authors of the book. They will go through the different chapters, and in the end we'll have a Q&A session. I invite you all to ask questions either by writing your question and giving it to the stewards, or by writing it in the streaming platform. Please, I'm going to ask the people that are going to participate in the opening session to come to the stage, and let's start. Thank you very much.
Tiene la palabra.
I'll give the floor to Repsol's chairman, Antonio Brufau. Good morning. The Admiral and General Secretary of the Ministry of Defense, dear head of the Spanish Defense Study System, also the chairwoman of the Spanish Energy Club. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to invite you to the headquarters to present Energy and Geostrategy 2022 in its 9th edition. It has become a reference both for the energy sector, for the academy, and also for the military sector. And I would like to congratulate Enerclub, the Spanish Committee of the World Energy Council, and the Spanish Institute of Strategic Studies for making possible this new edition. 12 months since our last virtual meeting, it's incredible to be able to be here again in such a setting with all of you after 2 unexpected years due to a virus that kept us at home for weeks and that led to economic stagnation. We all wanted a relief, but nothing further from that. The pandemic has continued in several areas of the world, for instance in China, and they are trying to stop the propagation of COVID-19, and that's why they need to carry out massive lockdowns, blocking roads, airports, isolating employees, and closing many factories outside the healthcare sector. This is having serious effects on the supply chain, and we're having bottlenecks in the world trade system, delaying the deliveries and increasing the price of products. In the most difficult times at the beginning of 2022, we've seen also how Russia went ahead with its threats and carried out an invasion in the Ukraine. That we condemned that action, as well as, and I represent not just myself, but everyone working here at Repsol. And I would like to show my solidarity with the Ukraine people. The war effects that have been going for 3 months are already clear in many sectors of the global economy. The costs of energy, the stability of the financial markets, and the export of agricultural products already feel the consequences of the conflict. At a European level, this means that geopolitics and energy go hand in hand, and therefore we need to reflect upon it. It is true that the threat of Russia has led to greater unity in Europe, and we have seen changes in its defense system, and also it has increased the political and economic sanctions against Russia and its global application, the global application. I hope that this will also go into the energy sector. I think that there is time to think about something that 30 years ago was considered a goal and that as Europeans we were not able to achieve. And here I'm talking about the single energy market. Energy in Europe is a common good for all citizens. There shouldn't be separate policies in isolation or ones against the others. However, this crisis has shown certain weaknesses in Europe, specifically the lack of preparation in order to overcome the high energy dependency. Given that we do not have our own energy, or not as much as we need to import it. And for that, we are forced to try and find ASAP ways in order to overcome the situation with the final goal of continuing with our progress. If we want to continue transforming our society to one that's less intensive in coal in order to be carbon neutral in terms of greenhouse gases for 2050, if we want to carry out and develop better welfare and well-being, we need to have good energy that is not competitive and that is sustainable. If the present is uncertain, the future is highly concerning if we do not react. Obviously, the European and Spanish authorities have acted swiftly due to the crisis in Ukraine and have created Repower Europe, a strategy that wants to have greater autonomy to decrease the dependency in Russia, to diversify oil and gas supply, and to promote green hydrogen and other renewable gases. However, the fact that currently we are still trying to define the need to diversify supply sources for fossil fuels and to increase oil and gas suppliers, then obviously the lack of energy preparation in Europe is clear. We must not get this wrong again, because this will happen again in the future. Europe is not independent in this future. Our decarbonization path depends on many minerals such as lithium, cobalt, magnesium, or technologies such as microchips, wind turbines, or solar panels, etc. And all of them, unfortunately, have a common denominator, which is called China. As I said at the beginning of my talk, the problem in the supply chain is not just a risk for the future, but they are the consequence. Well, other consequences can also be seen in the present. That is why I'm quite surprised by the European opacity, as well as that from international organizations, when there are discussions that are difficult to understand, bearing in mind the social consequences, geopolitical and environmental consequences for the planet, when we go into the new era of mineral extraction that will be key for the new energy transition plan, and that to a certain extent will replace the role that fossil fuels have played in the past. That's why geopolitics and the consequences of this transition are key and force us to reflect upon the way in which Europe and the planet as a whole will face the future in the year 2050. And that is why I think it's now the time to aim for a decarbonization model for the next 30 years based on technological neutrality, far from dogmas, a model that guarantees that there is no lack of supply or unacceptable increases in prices of energy and minerals. Believing that renewable electrification is the only solution to the lack of independence is wrong. Compared to the other energies, renewable energies are energies that require large investments in order to be constant. We need storage, networks, a huge amount of batteries and renewable hydrogen, and therefore critical minerals. And that's why decarbonization will come through the gradual reduction, but planned reduction, of fossil fuels that will continue to be important over the next few decades, of renewable generation, of a circular economy and biofuels, of fuels low in carbon emissions, synthetic fuels, and the technology of how we capture CO2 from the atmosphere. We need to support all the alternative sources to reach a goal, which is the goal that we all want, decarbonization by the year 2050. As concerning is the political situation in Europe. We can see the breakup of relationships between Algeria and Morocco last month, and the subsequent consequences for Europe that for 25 years has been taking natural gas from Algeria to the Iberian Peninsula through Morocco. I also must remember Libya, a country that's not dear to all of us and very relevant for Repsol, but a key player for energy security in Spain and in the south of Europe. A country that for over a decade has been the battleground of international geopolitics. A year and a half ago, we welcomed the permanent ceasefire. The advancements in the first few months of the year shows peace and long-lasting sustainability. However, due to the the failing of the elections in December, we can see that the situation between the East and the West, and that civil war has restarted, and they've gone into a new episode of conflict. We hope Libya will return to stability, and it's also the responsibility of the EU to give resources to ensure that stability, making sure that the south of Europe can continue being as a common space, fostering productive exchanges and cultural and social exchanges as we've had for centuries. Many things have happened since we met last time, and many things have an impact on energy. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, geostrategy and geoenergy are two sides of the same coin. Publications such as the one that we have here, and we are happy to present here, show that. I think the quality and the level of the authors of this book shows that there will be a very interesting discussion that will be heard by Claudio Aranzadi. And I would like to thank him for his commitment with the project, because he accepted for the 9th consecutive year, and that has a lot of merit, to coordinate the publication. I don't want to extend any further. Once again, thank you very much and welcome for being here. And I hope that you will think that this seminar is fruitful for you all. And I give the floor to Iñigo Díaz, the president of the Spanish Committee of the World Energy Council. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Admiral, General Secretary of Defense, Chairman of Repsol, Chairwoman of the Spanish Energy Club, dear friends, thank you very much for being here at the presentation of the new publication, the 9th edition, a project that we work together between the Spanish Institute of Strategic Studies and the Spanish Committee of the World Energy Council. The data will be very interesting, but I think that whoever takes the book home with them, please remember that we started working on it before the summer, and things have changed a lot since then. The publications started being published at the end of the year. So the content will continue to be interesting, but obviously you need to know that we're reading something that was written well before the current events. We were on a pandemic and energy crisis, but we didn't imagine that we will also be in the midst of a war in Europe with human consequences that are tragic, but which also entails a huge impact at all levels in the energy sector too. If the authors of this edition had the opportunity to rewrite it, I am sure the approach will change significantly. But the topics discussed will continue to be of importance. The first chapter focuses on the checkpoints of maritime international transport. There are several episodes that have reminded us of the vital importance of these paths for the supply of our commodities in the current scenario. It is important to continue giving them special attention and to be listening in to the new changes that could happen with the Russian and Ukrainian war. Also, we need to focus on geographic distribution of the new resources that are necessary for the transition, as the chairman of Repsol has said. The second chapter talks about the relationship between the decarbonization policies, CO2 trade, and international trade. And it focuses on the current tools, how the taxing ATS models in Europe and others are important for this trade. Given potential an increase of price on CO2 prices, there will be great risks of carbon leaks in some other countries, as happens in the EU. In this case, mechanisms such as the adjustment of carbon at the border or the Fit for 45 that are included in this chapter are necessary to maintain the productivity of our industries. Together with CO2 prices, another factor that will condition the speed of the transition will be R&D and I. Many technologies are already available, but there are many others, such as the technologies of capture, transport, storage, and use of CO2 that will all still need quite a lot of work being done on them. And that's what we focus on this third chapter, the strategies and paces of the different countries and that they develop for this technology will have geopolitical effects, also in terms of competitiveness that we must not forget. And I finish with the fourth and last chapter that is focused on cybersecurity. There are increasingly more awareness and readiness about this topic, but the truth is that increasingly more those cybersecurity incidents affect our supplies and our security. And now with this war that some experts believe it's a hybrid war, we need to continue giving priority in our agendas. We need to make sure that cybersecurity is an essential factor in all our security policies. I do not want to extend myself any further. We just like to congratulate and thank everyone that made this project possible. Former Minister Claudio Aranzadi, that has been the coordinator for many years, the authors. I would like to thank the Spanish Committee and the Spanish Institute of Strategic Studies and others. I would also like to thank Repsol, because they launched this project 9 years ago. Thank you very much for hosting us in your headquarters. And I'll give the floor to Zingoni, the chairman of the Spanish Energy Club. Thank you.
Almirante. Admiral, General Secretary of Defense Policy, President of Repsol, the General Secretary of the Strategic Studies, authorities, friends. It's a true pleasure to me to be able to participate yet another again in the organisation of this event to present the 2022 version of Energy and Geostrategy. This is one of the publications of the World Energy Council Spanish Committee and the Enerclub, and this is its 9th edition this year. As far as I know, there is no other publication in Spain that relates, as this one does, the most important subjects related to energy and geostrategy. So I would like to truly congratulate all the people who have made this possible. Throughout the different editions of this energy and strategy book, we could see the relationship between the world of energy and geostrategy, and they have been increasingly more complex. This year, 2022, with a dramatic war that we're all experiencing in Europe, the complexity is even worse, should we say. So beyond the terrible consequences on a human level, this conflict represents a turning point and important changes in international relations, with profound simplifications in our sector, because we have a high European dependence of the energy that we import from Russia. So we have security of supply problems of cost and sustainability. They are now the main stage of all debates, and it's obvious how urgent it is to find or strike a balance between these three components. The European Union has been obliged to find a quick response to this, and with this repowering UE communication and the plan that stemmed from it that came into effect in March. Obviously, there is controversy between different countries, but it's been a response for coordination and unity, which also has to be well recognized. It increase our energy independence. You can't do overnight. This is a very difficult process, and it requires mobilization on all different levels, from the supranational institutions and citizens themselves. But I'm sure we're able to achieve this. The incentives now are more important and stronger than ever before. So all I have to say now, we have the decarbonization process in this particular context. As has been mentioned in many different fora, decarbonization of the European Union has gone from being a strategic essential. Now we have to make it important to have investments in renewables and energy efficiency, and also in, should we say, leading edge technologies. And so to face the Russian issue, we have to try and achieve our objectives that we have set up. The energy crisis at the moment has reminded us that the access to, affordable energy and the security of supply are not always, shouldn't just be accepted as something that is normal. These concepts have to be highly present in our strategies. We have to work ceaselessly towards this fair energy transition that also fulfills citizens' expectations. We have to manage this process by avoiding or minimizing new risks and dependency, being very careful not to replace some bottlenecks with other bottlenecks. And finally, as we have said so many times, Europe cannot and shouldn't do this work alone. The energy sector can't be independent either. The fight against the climate change and taking into account the Russian and Ukraine conflict, this needs a global response. Here, the importance of diplomacy and cooperation on all different levels. Administrative interrelations, companies, citizens, and amongst all of us and all sectors of the economy. So the measures that were published by the European Commission last year are looking and trying to contribute solutions related to these issues. I would now like to end by highlighting the value of energy in this context. And I would also like to say, along with the others, thank you to all the people and institutions who have made this possible. Again, I would like to give you a very sincere congratulations. And I would now like to give the floor to Juan Francisco Martínez, who is the Admiral and General Secretary of the Defence Policy at the Ministry of Defence. Thank you very much, Admiral, for being here for the third consecutive year. You now have the floor, sir. Dear President, Lady President, authorities, civilians, military, dear friends, good morning, everyone. And I feel a true pleasure and honor for me to be here for the third year for this meeting to present the book Energy and Geostrategy in its 2022 edition. The energy supplies have an influence on any human activity. This has happened through history, and they increasingly have more influence in whether it's in the industry, in trade, in entertainment, welfare, even going to a supermarket. Energy creates a lot of dependencies between countries. It has a big influence on conflicts, and it unbalances macro objectives, and so macroeconomic and macro country influences as well as families' economies. And if that isn't enough, the excessive consumption of fossil fuels is unbalancing too and destabilizes the climate, and it has effects that have been proven, and they're very highly devastating in lots of places of the world, especially along the tropics. Therefore, this is a moment where I think that we all realize that there is energy stress. It's true that we have made a lot of progress, but also we have to recognize that we haven't evolved sufficiently. Our energy is based mainly on the same energy that was used in the second industrial revolution, in fact, even the first industrial revolution. Simultaneously, we discovered that energy security doesn't respond just to, equation which is just adding up things like availabilities and resources on the one hand and needs on the other hand. And this is factorized by the fact that we have to have access at choke points, etc. And this equation, if you add to these bottlenecks, which are often unexpected and we had never considered them in the past, and there's other intangible issues too. So how could we explain the catalytic effect of a localized war? Well, obviously there's a lot of energy related to the war, but it can go towards one side or towards another side. But there's lots of alternatives, but however, it has such a catalytic effect on the perceptions, on the prices, on the perception of the security of supply. And this is fueling a geography of disconnection in the West. After the Marshall Plan, after the Second World War, this had been progressing. Initially very slowly, and then very quickly, and especially when internet came on the scene, and obviously, a lot of maritime and air traffic. And this was all part of a globalization project, which has provided and is providing an increase in the welfare on a global level. Obviously, there are certain differences. Some countries progress more and others less, but there is a general increase in wealth worldwide. However, we are now realizing that there is this decoupling taking place. Russia is, sort of disconnecting from Europe. We have an architecture of security that's based on 3 pillars. We have the nuclear balance, the conventional energy balance, and a process which is agreed to control arms. And this was something that we used to call these measures of trust. But it will be impossible to maintain this over a next period of time. So we need to have an architecture of security in Europe, and we have to accept this responsibility, even if we don't like. But we have to offer a future to our children and to our grandchildren of a security architecture that I'm sure that's based on this lack of trust. Because it doesn't only fuel the table or a panel looking for peace and security, but we also have to look for energy security. As we said, Russia and the rest of the world are decoupling. Also, China is now decoupling from the United States. So it's very important for us as Europeans. We have to be this third factor, or should we say this third element in this equation. But what is even more concerning, I think, apart from China and Russia, is the fact that we need to strengthen here, there, and everywhere the geography of being selfish, because this is being damaging, for certain countries. Saying me first. This me first, this self-absorption. We have mass migration. We have drugs, organized crime. Climate. Does it have a frontier? So looking at this type of world, which is global, but on the other hand, it's still a tiny village. And this self-absorption is giving rise to a lot of fragmentation. And we have to fight against it. And energy is probably, I don't know if it's the main factor, but it is a factor that is so important in this new geostrategic strategy. Well, not everything is pessimistic. On the contrary, we think there is a lot of hope in the reaction, because we're seeing people and everyone are putting a lot of progress in the search for clean sources of energy, for storage, which are environmentally friendly. And it's true to say that when you hear, when we're having a breakfast before, we heard the word hydrogen. And obviously, the experts know that there is complications related to hydrogen-based energy. And then we have obviously nuclear energy, and that's still there. But anyway, we should believe in the fact that people really find ideas and ways out. And this book that was being presented today, there are very interesting issues like the decarbonization processes, the ability to capture CO2, and also other permanent issues, which is the return of these choke points, the maritime ones, and other political cases in different countries. So, to sum up, as year, this book is still a reference, an important reference. It's just such a luxury to have this book, and I would like to thank the coordinator and the authors for all their effort that they put in each year to provide us with this marvelous book. I would also like to thank the sponsors, Repsol, CEPSA, the World Energy Council, or the Enerclub, which is the Spanish club, and all the other sponsors for doing such hard work. And I also would like to highlight the part which I am responsible for, which is also the work of the Spanish Institute for Strategic Studies at the Ministry of Defense. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you all very much. And so now let's start our second panel session today. We're going to have a conversation with the Center for National Defense Studies, who is Mr. Francisco José Dacoba. Welcome once again. Thank you very much. It's a true pleasure to be here again. After these 2 difficult years, we've had to get back to normality. Well, now we're going to talk about, current issues related to geopolitics. And we have to talk about Ukraine. So where are we? What do you think about the effect? And what can we expect on the short and medium term? Well, the question is not a surprise at all. Well, in effect, even knowing the plan of the Russian chief of staff when they started their invasion on the 24th of February, after 3 months of combat, very hard times, the situation where we are now is not what Russia was expecting, because it's very bloody Ukrainian defense, and with the support of countries, especially the US, which has meant that one of the Russian forces have changed their initial plans, and they're now so ambitious today, they've changed their initial objectives, and so therefore we're currently in a situation whereby we can now, I think, rule out, apart from the uncertainty that we've just heard about earlier, we can now rule out, should we say, the 2 extreme scenarios, like a complete defeat of Ukraine. This hasn't happened, and it doesn't seem like it will happen, the full defeat, because obviously we're talking about Russia has got a nuclear power, and also now there's a big scenario which is full of uncertainty, in which maybe the fighting that we have been seeing up until today, at some point in time they will have to slow down or be less intense, even if it's just because both sides are exhausted and they've had a lot of deaths, and obviously material equipment have been negatively affected, especially for Ukraine. And I'm not, the fighting will have to reduce the intensity, but it may not necessarily disappear, because this conflict stems from the year 2014. There has been fighting, and when we're looking at the Donbass region at the moment, and there's a lot of human victims, so therefore I think there's still going to be a lot of victims. But also, what has already been mentioned is we have a war which is a hybrid war, so there's a lot of disinformation, shall we say, and also there is a lot of activity in the cyberspace. We've got these cybernetic attacks and other things. Is there a space for negotiation? Well, I'm sure that at some moment in time we will have to set up a negotiation panel, but that's going to be very difficult. It's been tried in Turkey, and we've all seen the results. And it's going to be very difficult why one of the contenders considers, we're still in this particular phase, that they can have some sort of advantage if the fighting continues. An advantage that they think will give them some sort of possibility of beating the other side. It will be very difficult, because the positions of both contenders are completely different. So it's going to be very difficult to come to an agreement that is feasible and sustainable. But we're hearing a few comments and voices there that are saying that they were going to now call a diplomatic solution. And I think that at one moment in time we're going to have to resort to this diplomatic solution. But it's very difficult at the moment, because the starting points of both sides are completely different. And therefore, as I say, it's getting very difficult to manage the situation. Thank you very much. Well, continuing with the Ukraine conflict, we have read over and over again, and it says there'll be serious and profound consequences on a world level. So in your opinion, what do you think the repercussions are going to be? And how do you think all the different players are repositioning themselves? Well, to understand the position of all the different players on the world level, we have to start and look at the fact this is a new chapter in the conflict, which between the Ukraine and Russia. And obviously the international scenario was already full of pressure. If we can remember recently, we have experienced the last few years, I think this was also mentioned this morning by some of the countries, they said, we have seen there's been an exchange of sanctions and trade tariffs. And obviously this has affected Spain too, an exchange also of technology. We can remember the Huawei. They have the 5.0 fractured. So there's a lot of geopolitical stress that's already been seen. And also when this new chapter has seen of this confrontation, well, I think the positioning has been quite expected. In fact, there's been a certain core countries, may call it just the West, who have positioned themselves on the side of the Ukraine. They're against this invasion and they're helping the Ukraine. And the other rest of their international community are managing, or they're sort of sailing through some sort of ambiguity, maybe an intelligent ambiguity, but without offering support or justifying the Russian invasion. China hasn't done that, but of course they haven't closed off their communication channels with Russia, either trade and technology and also energy, which is why we're here today. Energy is the basis of Russian power, and this is obvious. And of course, what Russia is doing as a consequence of this unexpected for them evolution of the war. And so what they have to need is to look for the or the surplus energy gas that they had in the world. It's not going to be easy or quick because we need to build infrastructure. It's going to be very expensive because it's very expensive to build these infrastructures. So Europe on our side, and we're suffering from the direct impact of the war. And it seems that we're going to try and cut off our energy dependence from Russia. But that's not easy either, because it's not going to be either quick or cheap. The United States obviously are suffering the consequences in a very different way to us, but it's also true to say that from someone in Wisconsin in the United States, obviously the price of their fuel has gone up considerably just to fill up a tank of petrol. So obviously China, it seems that they're benefiting from friendly energy prices, and the NATO, well, it's, the summit here in Madrid will be held in a month's time, and it seems that they're getting stronger. And it means there gives reason to actually having a NATO at the moment. And we can see there's a lot of tension is building up. And so also Russia has now said that they are going to increase their military presence on this new frontier between NATO countries and Russia.
It will also be very interesting to follow India, which is a very important player for many reasons, and they have wonderful traditional relationships with Russia in terms of arms and energy, but they're also therefore very interested in continuing the relationship with the US and other countries from the Indian Pacific region. Also, Biden went to the region urging support, and India also needs support in this relationship with West and with the traditional rival, which is China. And then for Spain, even though in the following panel they will talk more about it, but what we need to do is to continue guaranteeing energy diversity through a multiplicity of suppliers. We need to manage in a smart way our relationships with other countries. I'm talking about Algeria and Morocco, that are also traditionally opposed to each other. And in fact, one of the two gas pipelines that came from Algeria closed down not that long ago. And we need to try and make sure we can do the most of our strategic position, our great gas infrastructure, to make sure we offer ourselves as an alternative or to improve the energy security of the whole of Europe. Okay, to finish the last third question. It's true that the media may focus so much on the Ukraine situation that they will leave aside other things that are happening in the world. What things are under the radar at the moment? Well, it is true. It's true that the Ukrainian war may not let us see the forest, we could say. And the truth is that this new war in the Ukraine comes in a world that was already with high tensions and very polarized. And therefore, the speed at which events happen means that sometimes we leave aside others, and we were saying this at breakfast too, other events that a week or a few weeks back would be in the focus, such as Afghanistan, or the way in which things are happening there, and the relevance that that will have clearly in the future. But it seems that people, are not remembering about Afghanistan. We could also talk about globalization or the problems that we had during the pandemic. There is also the situation in different scenarios. So rather than conflicts, we see in them, but there's a lot of conflictness from a financial perspective, from a technological perspective too, that I think is very relevant and concerning, because it's in silos again, from a trade perspective, but also from a technological perspective. And I don't think these silos are a good option for the future of our children or our grandchildren. And then from a geopolitical perspective, or conflicts, as you've mentioned, then we have the Indian Pacific region, which has very concerning prospects. There's a situation in Africa, where we as Spaniards, as Europeans, we need to be vested on that. We need to put our attention to them. Then there's the Middle East. Even though we don't talk about them, they're still there. The war in Syria is still there. Yemen, Iran, nuclear Iran that we haven't managed to reach the nuclear agreement that we had in the past, and then other conflicts that are happening. Maybe the most important one will be Taiwan. The last riots there, and the statements by Biden do not give us peace of mind. So this will be a problem in the future, but I'm sure sooner rather than later there will be discussions, and I'm sure it will be included in the next editions of our book. Well, thank you very much. It was an honor to have you. Thank you very much for your reflections that allow us to understand better the situation that we're living and its consequences. And we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
A continuación vamos a ver un
Now we're going to watch a video with a message by Angela Wilkinson, which is the Secretary General of the World Energy Council.
And to everyone joining online today, hello and good morning. As the 6th Secretary General of the World Energy Council, I'm delighted to be part of today's 2022 Energy and Geostrategy event. I'd like to thank Repsol as hosts, as well as our friends at Enerclub and the Council's Spanish Member Committee for inviting me to address you this morning and to share in the celebrations of the launch of the 9th edition of the Energy and Geostrategy publication. It is a great pleasure to contribute to this year's publication. Many of the themes covered are highly relevant around the world and are echoed by the findings of our recent World Energy Pulse. The triple crisis of COVID, climate and conflict has triggered a global energy shock and cost of living crisis in all regions. Energy security is now vying with climate security for pole position. The Pulse shows that governments need to do more to tackle connected challenges in a new context of affordability and energy justice. Our humanising energy narrative provides a different narrative to people to help them understand their role in clean and just energy transitions. Involving more people, including energy users, workers and women and diverse communities, is the best way to progress successful energy transitions worldwide. Only with the support and active engagement of leaders such as yourselves can we hope to deliver better energy solutions for billions more decent lives and a healthy planet? I wish you a successful event and look forward to our continuing conversations.
Ahora la tercera parte del evento.
Well, thank you very much. Now we have Claudio Aranzadi and the authors that will talk to us about the different chapters of the book. Please come to the stage. And I would also like to remind you that you still have time to send your questions in writing, either here or through the channel, the platform. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muy buenos días.
Good morning and welcome to a face-to-face session after 2 years in which we haven't been able to do it due to the unfortunate virus. We have mentioned many things in the previous talks. Espada talked about the 4 chapters that are part of this new edition. And here we have the authors. As well as Angela Wilkinson, that's also, she's in an interview every 3 years. We do an interview to someone relevant in the world of geostrategy and energy. And as you have followed the editions, you know that. So this year it was Angela Wilkinson, the Secretary General of the World Energy Council, that was interviewed for this publication, for this edition. This year we have 4 important chapters. Well, we have an article by the Chief Vice Almirant on choke points, the Vice Admiral, sorry. Then also Jennifer Winter, I would like to thank her for being here in this session present, having to travel so far, about the emissions market and the international trade. Then another one by Alberto Pinedo, a chapter on cybersecurity. Even though Alberto Pinedo is not here, so we have Carlos Machado Martín, who's also collaborated closely in the drafting of this chapter on cybersecurity. Was also discussed 3 years ago in an article by Alberto Carabajo regarding the safety of the energy or security of the energy sector. In this case, we do a complementary analysis. And then finally, we have a joint article between Vicente Cortés and Benito Navarrete about CO2 capture, or CO2 capture, confinement, and use of CO2. Before, Iñigo Díaz de Espada said that something that's important to remember. This publication, this edition, was published before the beginning of the year, before the important event of the invasion in the Ukraine by Russia. This does not affect a lot the 4 chapters, which, because their nature goes beyond that specific situation, but it does affect the introduction that I wrote when we look at the most relevant events of the period between the 2 publications. Obviously, I don't talk about the war. There is an analysis about the tension in the markets, because this context, that situation of market tension and energy prices started in the last third of 2021. But the invasion has changed things dramatically. In fact, implicitly, in the introduction, I say that the probability of an invasion was low, we said. Obviously, I failed on that. Because, well, why? Because we thought that the threat of sanctions would deter Putin and the invasion, but that did not happen. So the advantage of getting it wrong is that, and I take full responsibility for that, is that many of us got it wrong, right? Many experts got it wrong. So, well, at least it's not that getting it, if it, many people get it wrong fixes anything. It doesn't. But at least there's that herd protection, and at least making sure that getting it wrong with the majority rather than a minority is easier. And also the markets got it wrong, because if we looked at the prices of the term prices for energy in Europe, this just before the invasion, the price that it was listed in April was 24 megawatts hour. Why? Because all the analysts thought that the tension of prices in the second half of the year was due, obviously, the decrease of gas supply from Russia in the last quarter also helped to that, but it was not political. It was macroeconomic issues. It was to do with the COVID rebounds, also weather situations, etc. But that they said a perfect storm would go back to normal, and that therefore we would see a scenario of normal prices in the second half of the year. Obviously, that is not going to be the case, and I'm going to add to what is said in the introduction of the book that as a forecast it was totally wrong. Even if I didn't say explicitly, I said there was not going to be an invasion. I didn't say it explicitly, but implicitly I did. But the fact in itself is, from energy geopolitics, is a major event. Also because it shows something that, shows an inappropriate balance. Before, I think, someone talked about cost, security, availability. And in that dilemma, especially cost, security, that balance shows that was a balance that was inappropriate in the EU. It was more focused on cost. Why? Because the policy of gas dependency from Russia, in the gas pipeline, the cost was more reasonable from a cost perspective. The using of the gas through the pipeline from Russia, at least for the Eastern Europe and Mid Europe, it made more sense. It was better than bringing it from the US, plus the cost of gasification and liquefaction. What's happened? The assessment of the geopolitical risk of the attack by Russia was not expected. No one thought that they were going to take a step that would entail the risk not just of high prices, but also the risk of the break of supply, a stop on the supply physically. Another thing that we can consider to be not an appropriate strategy from Europe perspective is the traditional policy of connections between the Iberian Peninsula and the rest of Europe, both in the electricity sector but also in the gas sector. If we remember why the MidCat was stopped, it was because it wasn't profitable enough. Once again, the profitability security balance was shown not appropriately. Now the Commission has realized that that was a mistake, And now when we look at the new infrastructures expected for in Power EU, we can see the huge mistake we made by not making the most of the storage capacity and gasification capacity that we have in Spain. As well as stating things that we didn't do, we didn't forecast properly. Obviously, we can say that after the event has happened. I mean, no one can really thought that that was going to be the case. But obviously, the responsibilities are still there. But it's easier to see it now, after the event has happened, than to predict it. If we think about the focus for the future, what are the main characteristics of the future, especially in Europe, in the energy sector? Well, I got it wrong before, so I'm not going to make forecasts and get it wrong again. But what can we say? Well, I think it's based on great uncertainty because it depends on the duration of the war conflict. The general already spoke about all the geopolitical scenario in which we are immersed. But there's also something very important, what the outcome will be. The war will not last forever. At some point, it will have to come to an end and reach some kind of agreement. It seems that the outcome will be a more deglobalized situation, as the general said, with greater decoupling. We don't know what's going to happen to China, but at least a greater decoupling of Russia, and also a new configuration of energy flows that will depend on how Russia fits into that new scenario that is more deglobalized and that will come true at the end of the conflict. And that's a major topic. Russia is the second exporter of oil, very close to the first, which is Saudi Arabia is the first exporter of gas. One thing that we tend to forget is that Russia is the first exporter, we could say, of conversion services and uranium enrichment. In very high percentages, between 40 and 45% of the uranium enriched and of the nuclear process of many, many countries, not just Russia or the ex-USSR, but we're talking about Turkey and many other countries. Also, as Tony Brufau was talking about another important issue, which is critical minerals.
Nickel, aluminium, etc. So what was going to happen with Russia? If it's not even clear what's going to happen tomorrow. You know, the short term is uncertain and also the long term. You know, the sanctions have been increasing and there's lots of issues related to the embargo, related to oil and gas. You know, there's a problem for replacing it to stop the dependence, especially for Germany. It's true, and this has already been mentioned this morning, there's a European power called Repower EU, which has got a whole program of measures for energy saving, energy efficiency, renewables, to extend the life of nuclear power plants, green hydrogen, clean fuels. So there's also extraordinary measures like the decentralized contracts for gas. And these have been a few of the effects that is part of this project called Gas to Us. So there's a series of measures all are acceptable and very interesting too. But the objective of Repower EU is to replace 2/3 of the gas purchases from Russia before the winter. But some of these measures are really only for the medium and long-term effects. However, within this story and this uncertain future on the medium and long term, as we say, in this scenario that is uncertain, I think we still maintain certain issues that will not be changed on the long term. This is related to decarbonization policy and the energy transition policy. However, what has been shown by Repower and the measures that have been taken on the short term regarding prices is that the majority of the measures that are part of Repower EU are trying to accelerate the energy transition. But there are others that don't. Some of them, and that has been pointed out by the Managing Director of the Energy Institute, so the supply of oil, will it go down due to the embargo? 2, 3, 4 million, which are estimations of barrels from Russia. And that will be compensated to a certain extent because everyone's forgotten Iran, but it's also important to take into account Iran because there was an agreement with Iran who can add 1 to 3 million barrels a day. At the end, what has been pointed out by the World Energy Council Spanish Committee is that there is a drive to obviously make sure that we don't have a lack of supply from Russia. We need to increase this new capacity which is based on the oil upstream issue. And this is part of the report based on the objective to have 2050 neutral emissions. But we shouldn't have any more upstream oils. In the Financial Times yesterday, there was an interview, or it's a sort of interview, with the first executive at Aramco, who said completely the opposite, said they're going to increase the upstream capacity by 2 or 3 million, and it will be necessary to increase the capacity of oil production to confront situations like the situation that we've seen this year with the increase in prices. So this has opened up an important debate. As Director General of Energy has said, we will be changing our route, the initial route for the energy transition, to now cover on the short term this possible situation of having a deficit, because if Russia will no longer be part of the energy market. And we have forgotten that on the long term, that the COP in Glasgow ended with certain commitments. The formal commitments of all the different countries, they represented certain objectives, related to the increase in the temperature in the planet. But some experts say that, they need formal commitments, but obviously we need to study all the energy commitments and plans of each country. And it would mean that the temperature could go up by 2 degrees. So there's a gap between the implementation, which is obvious, not in ambition, but in the implementation. There's a commitment from all the countries to present new national energy plans and commitments. But obviously, with everything that's going on at the moment, it's very difficult to know what these plans are going to be like. And also the problem, the political problem related to all this context, so that the atmosphere of collaboration since the Paris Agreement could be affected negatively or due to the current context. I'm sorry, I think I've gone well over my time, so hopefully we can. I just wanted to obviously explain a little bit about the difference in what I wrote in the book and to the current situation. So anyway, I would just like to now mention the fact that the authors, obviously they can't offer a summary of their different chapters or their articles. It would make no sense because they've got very little time. But what can be done, I'm just going to ask them a couple of questions related to their articles so that they can give us a brief answer. So I think, Gonzalo, if you don't mind, let's start with you, to the Vice Admiral Gonzalo Sanz. So something that's not that well known for non-experts for these choke points. What is the role of the relationship between the international trade, and what is the current situation, the current relevance, and how can it change? Because we're going to have new energy flows and just new technological changes. Thank you. Well, this is the main issue in my article. It's easy to see. If anyone sees a map, or you can see a satellite photo of the world, it's obvious that, it's like which is the blue. And as you see, Magallanes, when he went on that kind of boat, you can see this was his route. And this allows us to go over the world without any restrictions whatsoever. So this has meant that the oceans are now a source of wealth and relationship between all countries and areas in the world. So I think it's essential to understand that the maritime trade offers exchanges to an scale that is just unthinkable compared to other means. And these are the current pillars of globalization. Over more than 50,000 big, large-sized locks, on which 90% of our trade move around the world. But the maritime traffic is actually based on economics, because what they're looking for is efficiency. And that efficiency is the one that allowed the maritime trade ensure that China and Japan are actually flooding all markets with their products. So taking all that into account, you have to take into current transport is what is known as the intermodal transport, which is combining the maritime transport mainly with land transport, but also with air transport on occasions. So therefore, what is critical about these sea routes is that they connect infrastructures that are able to load and unload these large vessels very quickly, and that they connect in a very agile manner to the points where the consumption is needed and can be there are places where we can transport the energy. So today we can see how important it is to have the application of these different criteria in the Belt and Road in China, and also what Japan do in certain ports in the Indian Ocean. Well, as I've already said, maritime trade tries to be as cheap as possible because there's a lot of competition in the global world. And so therefore, the routes of these merchant vessels are almost stable, and they have to be as short as possible. So it means it's compulsory for them to go through, should we go natural routes or artificial channels. But there could be alternative routes, but that would make the transport a lot more expensive. And this is what we know as these choke points. Maybe in Spain we could just call them something else, but they're known as choke points. And these are where the concentration of the traffic, the maritime traffic, is higher than other places. So that in itself is something that's a true risk for the security of trade and global supply. What is most important, in my opinion, is to be able to guarantee the freedom and the security of navigation through these different straits and channels, because by doing that we can guarantee a security of supply, both for the container traffic, raw materials, hydrocarbons, foodstuffs, etc. So the possibilities to limit the traffic or even to cut it off, because if we have a strait or a channel, they exist. And it's happened in the past. So lack of security in the world itself is often transferred to these maritime spaces and areas. And we all know that the Suez Canal or Hormuz or other straits are subject to a lot of different types of pressure. And this also happens with the Arctic routes, which are starting to open up, especially the route that goes from the northwest side. But I think what the most important thing is to understand, in the way we see things, everything seems to be guaranteed. And we see the future, quite calmly, should we say, but to a certain extent, our security, the security of our way of life, depends on the security of 10, 12, or 14 very narrow straits or channels all over the world. So it's very interesting for this to have been included in the national strategy that was approved in December 2021, which maintains the protection of the maritime routes and straits as something that is key to ensure European security and safety. Also, they mentioned the strategic implications that the opening up the Arctic routes could have. But there are also other choke points, even though it's different to what we're used to seeing. And they define that the risk for national security is a vulnerability of global maritime traffic and also the Spanish fishing fleet and the vulnerability of the energy when we're talking about the hydrocarbon supply of next few years. And so in short, and what it says is that the maritime security in general, and that is maritime trade, is something that requires specific, constant attention to the possible risk. The main idea is that nothing in the oceans comes for free, except its existence and the opportunities for progress that they provide us with. But we're also obliged to protect our oceans, to guarantee their sustainability, and to conserve the right for free navigation, which is what all the viability of maritime trade is based on, and also the progress of relations and interrelation. I think this is a very essential part of this work. Well, thank you very much, Vicente. I would now like to give the floor to Jennifer Winter. I think everybody has their headsets on. So as I say, please, there's two-way interpretation, so please put on your headsets. You can hear either English or Spanish. Yes, Jennifer, I hope you've been understanding what's going on. So the question for Jennifer Winter is related to her article where she analyzes the different possibilities of putting a price on CO2, based on standards and command and control and the European system and taxes. All these systems related to putting a price on CO2 makes it more expensive. You can see fossil fuels, fossil energies, and for the final domestic consumers. But obviously this is also important for industry. So many of these do not have the technology at the moment to replace the use of fossil fuels with a clean fuel or even from the clean electricity when it does exist. These are the possible alternatives. What could you talk about the policies that could be set up to face this possible loss of competitiveness that could be derived in the case of European companies due to the policies in specific countries, because they don't have very strong decarbonization policies. So I think it's probably better, Jennifer, if you explain this rather than me. So what policies can be set up to confront this possible loss of competitiveness and the leak of carbon in European companies?
It's a pleasure to be here this morning. The issue of emissions and trade and competitiveness is a fairly complicated and contentious topic. And I want to ground my remarks today in the Paris Agreement and the commitments that developed and developing countries have made. And key in the discussion of emissions pricing and emissions and trade is Article 2 and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in terms of emissions reductions. And this is particularly relevant because it is the developed countries, North America, the European Union, that are the ones that have generally developed emissions pricing. Currently, it's quite low, and that has mitigated some of the competitiveness concerns. And so the real issue is that in implementing unilateral climate policy, and that can be explicit pricing or environmental regulations, there's a risk of economic activity leaving the implementing country for jurisdictions with less stringent environmental policy, which is referred to as emissions leakage. And the concern is the country with the more stringent environmental policy loses economic activity, and there's little or no real change in global emissions because of that economic activity leaving. And when we think about the risk of leakage, it's primarily to, say, developing countries, which are generally more emissions intensive in their production. And so this is the major concern of implementing these stringent environmental policies. And there are three main mechanisms for mitigating these competitiveness effects. One is to exempt certain domestic industries, which, and generally it's the ones at risk of leakage are emissions intensive and trade exposed. And so that means that they have their higher emissions per dollar of output, and they have limited ability to pass on the cost of these environmental regulations. So exemption is probably generally not a great policy because it's exempting the most emissions intensive part of the economy from environmental regulation. And so while it protects these industries from the competitiveness effects, it's not consistent with environmental obligations. The second option is domestic policy. So internal domestic policy to mitigate the emissions pricing costs. And this can come in a variety of ways. It could be subsidizing these industries based on output or a free allocation of emissions permits like the EU ETS does and Canada's output-based pricing system, or it could be subsidies and supports for emissions reductions at specific facilities and things like that. And then the third option, which is I think potentially the most contentious, is border carbon adjustments. And so that's moving pricing to the point of import, and it equalizes the price in the domestic market for those importers. And it's contentious because in a way it's imposing domestic policy on importers. And remember, the risk of leakage is to those countries that are more emissions intensive in production. And so it's again, potentially inconsistent with Article 2 of the Paris Agreement of that common but differentiated responsibility, because it's imposing domestic policies effectively on these suppliers. And the last point I want to make is, right now, we're not seeing much evidence of leakage. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that generally emissions prices are low right now. Most countries have emissions prices below $20 US per ton. The second reason is there are these domestic supports to prevent leakage. So it makes sense that in the presence of low carbon pricing and domestic policies to mitigate leakage, we're not seeing much evidence. And then, I'm sorry, my jet lag is getting to me. I can't remember the third reason that we're not seeing much evidence of leakage, but it does have a potential significant effect on moving forward as we have the parties to the Paris Agreement implementing increasingly stringent environmental policies, that there is the potential for leakage. And then these policies to mitigate leakage, it really gets into the issue of burden sharing and how much we want to rely on domestic policy versus something like border carbon adjustments in a way to incentivize global emissions reductions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Gracias, Jennifer. Pasamos ahora.
Thank you very much. We go now to the chapter on cybersecurity, geopolitics, and energy. Alberto couldn't come, but Carlos Machado is here. And he will talk on behalf of both of them. Carlos, I give you the floor. What I wanted to talk about is, in a succinct manner, what are the main cyber threats that the energy companies should be attentive to, as well as the whole energy sector. In order to understand what bad actors we have behind, it's very important to put into context what is the technological strategy that the companies are using. And as you know, from a technological and processes point of view, there's decentralization, automation, digitization. This means that we talk about technologies that we know very well, such as the cloud, the Internet of Things, analytics in all senses. And this linked a little bit to the nature of the energy companies themselves, which are key infrastructures or essential services providers, as well as the technology that we have in the sector. These are assets that we consider to be cyber-physical. There is a cyber attack that could lead to a physical impact. In fact, there have been several incidents recently, over the last few years, in which we are seeing this type of physical digital world element, especially in the current conflict that we are seeing in Russia and the Ukraine. And then from there, we want players with different motivations. One of them could be nation states, and the motivation could be espionage. Those are destruction vectors that try to cause as much damage to the opponent as possible, and even stealing intellectual property. I think that this is very much the case. We've seen it recently, but it's been happening for a while. We could go back to 2015, where a partial blackout in the Ukraine, where 250,000 people had no electricity for quite a few hours. So this is what type of players. This is very much increasing, this type of attacks, and with greater geopolitical tension, greater the possibility of having these attacks. Then we have cyber criminals, which are very present, which try to monetize with a return on investment, with a maximum ROI, their investments. And basically what we can see is that in the end they focused in the past in sectors that were much more profitable or enticing from a financial point of view, where the dots and the ones were money, were currency. However, they've seen that by capturing certain assets of energy sector companies, they can also compromise the national security, they can affect essential services, and therefore they're attacking them to such an extent that many of the IT programs that are known as malware or virus are already targeting those technologies, those operation services, those control services. And then we have a third block, which is, I'm not sure if it's least important, the least important, but it's also very important, which is hack activists. So basically they move activism into the cyber world. And basically what they aim to do is, well, to present an idea or claim something. And for the energy sector, I mean, all the people here know what can be what their claims may be, or the goals that they have. They want to have a reputational impact, mainly on the sector's companies. And what does this mean? That traditionally companies from the energy sector had a model very much based on the perimeter. From a communications network perspective, everything that was in industrial centers or CMDs or computational centers was totally protected, isolated. Because of that perimeter, there was no access allowed, and those technicians that work there had to be physically there to make any actions, to carry out any actions. However, over the last few years, and with the different strategies of distribution, hybrid, and remote access, it means that the perimeter has disappeared. Now we have remote access by employees, by technologists that work on industrial centers or in plants. We see electronic devices connecting between them and accessing the cloud. So we are not within the walls of a castle anymore. This has opened up. And this openness, which generates efficiencies, obviously, and optimizes the business, has important risks. And so we have greater possibilities of attack by the different players. So we have to try and do is to evolve in our controls. Our controls in the past, which were very much targeted on the network control, or as little openness as possible. And now we have to focus in much more on the identity and the context of the users that access and what they access. If we are able to know who accesses, whether it's a machine or a human, makes no difference, and the context from where they're accessing, how they're accessing, if they're accessing from a country where we have presence or not, or that has no relationship to our business, let's say, that would help us, the context will help us to try and value the risk of that connection. And therefore we will decide on the actions that we want to do. We'll see whether there is a more robust or solid access required in order, rather than the normal username and password. And this is what many of the people here present have heard of, and the model of zero trust.
So basically, in general, that is what the panorama is reflecting in the current times. Well, to end, the two authors related to article on the capture, use, and confinement of CO2. Two questions, one for each of them. The first question, to what extent do you think that technology and the CO2 capture policy is essential to achieve the decarbonization objectives that were set up by the European community? Well, as we showed indirectly, we think it is essential for several different reasons, and I would just like to point out three. The first one is just that CO2 capture is the only alternative to decarbonization certain big industry effects. I'm talking about the cement industry. And the cement production, over 60% of the CO2 that they produce comes from the manufacturing process itself. It doesn't come from fossil fuel combustion. So the consequence is that there's 60% of CO2. To fight against it, we're going to have a capture of the CO2 that in their emissions. There may be others in other industry, but this, as we know, that the cement sector is very important and they have a lot of emissions worldwide. I think it represents 8% of the CO2 worldwide. Secondly, I would like to highlight the fact that the CO2 capture technology is the only option for the artificial sinks for CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is the only option that allows us to achieve net and negative emissions. So whether it's indirectly through biomass, which is biomass combustion, gasification, fermentation, and then obviously capturing the CO2 produced, so we can get, a reduction in the CO2 in the atmosphere, or directly through the direct capture in the atmosphere, which is more difficult on a technical level, especially on a financial level. And finally, the CO2 can be a perfect ally if it's a CO2 that's captured to achieve chemical products, and as you say, using the different fossils. So the combination of CO2 plus hydrogen to drive, for example, based on petrochemicals, this could become essential. And proof of this, the importance of the need of this alternative, is the fact that international bodies who are analyzing the climate, and those say they're experts in climate change or energy agencies, in the majority of the different scenarios that control the temperature of the climate, which should be to maintain it below this 1.5 or 2% increase in temperature. So this means that they need to make an improvement in the CO2 capture by 20%. Okay, thank you very much. And the last question is now related to capture and confinement of CO2, but related to how important it is to have the technology and to do away with energy dependency and on Russia. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having to ask me to contribute in the publication and to be here today. The Repower EU has something that's very specific, which is to promote the production of hydrogen and importing hydrogen, 10 million tons in 2020, and we have to by 2030, we need to import this. And making reference to what the president of Repsol said, we're going to change, apart from the need to import critical materials, but also we're going to have to need to import hydrogen. So we'll have to ensure that we have security of supply. So we want millions of tons a year of hydrogen needs to be imported. And renewables will have to be transported 3,000 kilometers, but there's no ammonia or ethanol. So hydrogen has unique properties, taking into account its transport and its energy density as far as volume is concerned. So therefore, with hydrogen, we cannot replace all the natural gas, all the oil products, derivative oil products, but we need two types of fuels, which are related to the renewables, which are renewable fuels, which are not from biological sources, and the non-recycled carbon sources. So obviously, in the time available, we're talking about ammonia, methanol, and synthetic fuels. For all of these, especially ammonia, needs CO2. So to combine that with hydrogen in a process that will end up providing with the products we need. So where does the CO2 have to come from so that the resulting product is renewable? The Commission says there are three sources. One, CO2 from the biomass combustion. Two, CO2 from an industrial origin that isn't based on fossil fuels, but there's not a lot of that, but some does exist. And three, which is quite surprising, direct capturing it in the air. The committee in the European Parliament last week, they're trying to ban the ones that come from synthetic resources. And also, I didn't understand when it says it's related to air and water, but I'm afraid I didn't actually understand what was being said at the European Union. But anyway, going back to them, with hydrogen is not essential for everything. It needs liquid fuels to transport it and to make sure it's suitable for the current infrastructure. For that, it needs CO2, and that CO2 comes from the three sources. And for that, we need carbon capture. And also, we need to do away with gas and oil from Russia. We need to have CO2 capture to combine it with renewables to get products which have got a carbon footprint that is in line with what has been envisaged. And that's it. Thank you very much. Well, okay. Now let's go to the floor to see if anybody has any question. We've tried to group the questions together. We have a series of questions, some of them specifically for you, admirals, and others are not for anyway, which refer to the NATO meeting, the possible joining of Sweden and Finland. What do you expect from this NATO summit that's going to be held in Madrid? That's one question. And then there are other questions, but let's start with that one. Let's start with a question related to NATO. Well, I was actually going to pass this to somebody else, to Mr. Almirante Núñez, who is actually more related to those issues, but from the standpoint, well, the more military standpoint, should we say, what we do know and what we do expect is that there will be approval of a new strategic concept for the NATO, because the current one's been going since 2010, after the Berlin Wall fell. So instead of being faced on collective defense, now we're going to be a little bit more of how to manage crisis. And so this means that, which we talk about, you know, issues that happen outside the NATO area, like Pakistan and areas in the world, like also taking into account Afghanistan. So change of the world order has now brought onto the scene the issue related to collective defense. We expect that this new strategic concept, I don't know the document, but I do know the changes of opinion that have taken place. So we think collective defense is now going to be the core issue to give reason to actually having a NATO. Not necessarily focused directly on Russia, because, you know, we will, obviously one of the NATO alliances is still to be against international terrorism. But I think now what we've been talking about today, about the main points related to, I said there's a lot of terrorist activities, especially in the Malacca Straits, and this are related to our choke points. So I just don't think I need to add anything else. Yes, can you hear me? Yes, I think Gonzalo has answered perfectly well. So what do we expect from this summit? Well, we're working on the, obviously, documents. What do we expect? Well, it's going to be a meeting point and an opening point. And we want to build bridges and work with other instruments, but we don't want it to be closed off institution, because we don't want it to be a world of exclusive people, because a lot of people on the outside as if they are citizens of a second division world. So it's important to get back the spirit of Madrid in '97, where after the Madrid summit, the NATO opened up to countries in the east. So Sweden and Finland, it's very important for them to join, and also it's important to consolidate them uniting with countries in the Pacific side of the world. So we're not just talking we want about a new Cold War against Russia. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult to do this. But what we want to do is offer some sort of hope in our reflections. And it's like something that started with the reflection of NATO 2030, which is very archetypal against, you know, collective defense and using dissuasion, should we say. So then we have a second draft now, and we were talking last week, in fact, in Washington with the Secretary of Defense of the United States, and today with the Secretary of State for Defense in England. Now we want to go into greater depth of dissuasion of this collective defense. But it's not just east-west. I think it needs to be 360 degree, and it's fueled. Obviously, each country has to provide its arguments. There's the northern European countries, but, you know, that compares like Russia, and then we have Africa. So all these issues need to be taken into account. So on the one hand, we need to have this issue related to the strength towards the east, and I think our strength needs to be seen worldwide. But also what we want to do is open up the dimension of the cooperative security, which is NATO, is a bit more European Union, but it is starting to build a bridge, and we need to try to promote the fact we want people to become members, because obviously we can see the influence of Spain. There's a lot of pressures on the fact that we want the European leaders to come here, and it also has a character related to it being a priority partner, and we want to be more open, and we want to be an instrument that's useful for safety and security. I don't want to go into different fragmentations, say, well, now because of the war, the crisis caused by the war, we're seeing that it just wants to be a closed shop. No. I think there are more, obviously a few hurdles along the way, but some of them, in fact, actually, maybe they could be, they're not actually hurdles, I think they're opportunities. Because I think the situation around us, we can see that there's been, well, we've been going, should we say, going backwards. Things sort of happened in Latin America, the American continent, and it's just gone through all the different sort of fractioned entities. Everything's very polarized because people can win elections by 50 or 51 versus 40, and there's two social models that are completely the opposite. So, and everything related, because of internet, everything is highly polarized. So because we've managed to include these little diamonds related to the transformation of building bridges and including the interoperability of the military, and also that obviously in those countries the armed forces have the power to try and transform the countries, and I think that is very important. And also in Africa and Latin America too, with the importance that will be given to women. The equality of women, we often do not understand that when we take soldiers to a mission, the fact that there is a possibility of contacting with 50% of the population. If you don't have women soldiers, you cannot contact with these women. It doesn't exist at all. So this situation, these countries which are, stuck in their old-fashioned ways, so we need peace and security, safe schools for children, but not safe schools because they're protected by the military. No. Children can develop, their future, which allows us from a strategic standpoint, and we need to look at the situation in Europe, the war in Ukraine, but we also want to look further afield. Well, thank you very much. Let's continue with the questions. Jennifer Winter, the question for you refers to the future context of energy leaks that you talked about, and also the low prices when you talked about 20 euros megawatt hour. But we're in Europe with different prices. Well, we're talking about dollars ton of CO2. In Europe, we're around 80. So what are the predictions that are done is that in 2030, I think we're going to be around 200, if I can remember correctly from memory. Do you think that, well, actually the question is, what do you think about the evolution? Do you think something could be done to control the prices? And I would also actually ask my own personal question, if you don't mind. Now in Europe, we have decided, in my opinion, by mistake of course, when we're talking about the cap and trade system, that's really confused with taxes. So when we're talking about the CO2 price, that for a long time was around $5 a ton, and now it's going up to 80, and then in the future it'll be at 200. Well, obviously we can't change exactly the system unless we get a unanimous agreement between all countries, obviously. So we've got to follow the cap and trade system. So even though this is supposed to be more efficient, but in practice, the price of the CO2 obviously isn't correct, because they are in effect for 20 or 30 years. So is it possible to do something similar as what the British did? The British had a floor for the CO2 price added to the maintenance of the markets of the emissions in Europe. So they had a cap on this, which allowed to have a reasonable price margin on the medium and long term, so that it will be a lot more stable for investments. I don't know what problems this would bring up for the European Union, apart from changing the internal system, which would be impossible. So, Jennifer, what do you think about this?
Thank you. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think to start with, I'll talk about the trade-offs associated with an explicit carbon price, like a tax that we have in Canada, mostly. Most provinces in Canada, and an emissions trading system. So it's a real trade-off between price certainty and quantity certainty is sort of the basics of it, in that with a tax system, you've got a clear price signal, and that allows for investment certainty and major decisions like technologies like CCUS and things like that is, all right, they know what the price is. The issue is that the emissions reductions are uncertain with that price signal because it depends on the emissions intensity of specific facilities and the technologies available and the substitution options for businesses and households. And so we don't know with certainty what the emissions reductions are. I mean, we have like modeling exercises to predict what it is, but that's a real challenge with the explicit price signal, is the uncertainty about whether or not countries can, say, meet their net zero commitments with a given price path. The benefit of an emissions trading system or a cap and trade system is that you have that quantity certainty. So you have a cap on emissions, and that's going to be increasingly stringent over time. And so you have that certainty around what emissions reductions will look like. The trade-off is the price is determined by the emissions trading system. And so that creates uncertainty for businesses. And I think it's also relevant for when thinking about the border carbon adjustments and the European Commission proposal, because the border carbon adjustment is going to be linked to the ETS price. And so that also creates uncertainty for European Union, the third countries trading with the European Union, in that they don't know what price they will face. And so that creates some really interesting and difficult incentives for emissions reductions in third countries. And then layer on top of that the adjustments that are proposed to be in place for prices in third countries also makes it complicated. And then I'm not sure how many layers we're at yet, but another layer of complexity is, say, countries like Canada, where there are these domestic policies to mitigate the costs of carbon pricing on emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors. So how does that price adjustment for carbon pricing at the border take into account both the emissions price in the third country and then any sort of domestic policy present that mitigates the cost? So it really is a very complex issue, and I think one that is going to be subject to a lot of negotiation. When you think about looking out to the future, we do have a commitment in the European Union and Canada to have an increasingly stringent explicit price in the case of Canada and implicit price with the increasing cap on emissions for the EU ETS. But it's really, those are the countries that have committed to this increasingly stringent environmental action. The US, it's really not clear how they're going to go about it. And so that creates the real risk for leakage. And I think it's going to be a major issue going forward, just because we have unilateral action on a set of actors which are actually right now at most risk for leakage. It's Canada and the European Union. And so that means any sort of agreement around border carbon adjustment or pricing will need to resolve these massive differences in both pricing and economic activity. And it'll be really fascinating to watch from an academic perspective. I don't envy the people who are actually figuring this out and making policy in government because of the complex nature of it.
Gracias, Jennifer. ¿Tú querías, Benito?
Thank you. Did you want to make a comment? Yes, it goes in line with the question. The price of CO2 will continue to increase, but will continue to increase the specific price. These are CO2 emissions for the emission rights in the EU, and they will go from it'll be at 4%, so therefore the prices will go up. But then what's important in terms of capturing is that at those prices, they'll come to a point when it's more competitive. Because it could be $100, $120 per ton. So the countries in the north of Europe that have the availability to transport and storage in the territorial waters of Norway, that have experience doing it, well, they are in a wonderful position because from a safety perspective of the business, those prices have been agreed. Therefore, I know that capturing and storing CO2 is going to cost me 75 euros per ton today. Tomorrow less because of the learning curve.
Well, I'm going to make the most of asking now, what is the CO2 price that makes the capture competitive, for example? Well, it could happen even in a gas power plant. And why, despite everything? Well, we've had moments when I think it was 80 euros a ton, but I think also there have been times when it's gone up to 100. So why is it taking such a long time to get these plants, these power plants, on a commercial side that includes CO2 if the expectations, unless of course there's not a mistake, is around 200 in the future? Because obviously, well, they are. You know, on these smaller sized, yes, we've got 4 projects that have been given permission from Antwerp and Rotterdam Port and from Wilhelmshaven to Equinor in Norway. And these projects have been passed and they will be up and running in 2025 or 2026 to transport these prices. Well, it depends where the CO2 comes from. CO2, which is based on ethane in the Antwerp port. So ethylene, which is 80% pure, well, capture, I think it costs like $35. Transport depends who transport it. And the storage, well, it depends what the Norwegians are going to charge. Well, now maybe 50 euros in total, 60 or 70. So that's, well, let me just make, well, the question is very specific for you two. You made a reference to a different speed of implementing to CO2 capture and confinement between the north and the south. Can this affect the competitiveness of the industries in these 2 different areas? Of course. The industry in North Europe has the ability to eliminate their CO2 because they have got processes. Well, what happens in South Europe? There's very few initiatives. There is one that's just starting out, which was started by Repsol in South France, but it's still got a long way to go before it's up and running. In North Europe, Equinor have the technology, and they have everything ready to inject it because they've been doing it since the year 2012. But this is a very important thing for South Europe. In Algiers, they have got depleted gas fields, but they have got technology to store CO2. So this could cause some sort of disruption between where the adjustment on the borders is worrying because it means that the products are going to come from Algiers without CO2 because it's been captured and stored there. So there could be a paradox that we pay in Algiers for products that are combined with CO2, and then we have to pay it somewhere else because the carbon pays when it comes in, it's paid when it goes out. This is a scenario that I see that could happen in South Europe, because obviously to capture CO2 in Algeciras or in Bilbao and to transport it to Norway, has a cost that you have to add to all these other figures that we were talking. And then, of course, we have the competitiveness to take into account. For Carlos Manchado, there's a very specific question for you. You were talking about cyber threats. Who are involved in this sort of market, and how does it work, or how does it happen? I have no idea about the cyber world. Well, there is a market for a long time now, and not just a market, there is a whole network set up. There are these criminal bands that exist in the physical world and in the cyber world. We can talk about cartels. It's like an industry in itself, in which specific players develop, these badware, which could damage our technological assets. And there are other groups or other gangs who get access into certain companies. Even they can specify on sectors, the energy sector, the finance sector, or wherever. And also there are other members. So what they do, I'm simplifying a lot, they make the most of suppliers to buy accesses on the one hand, and then also what they're going to, should we detonate there? We're talking about cybernetic terms, of course. And they just make the most of these two suppliers to monetize the activity that they're going to do. So it's a very broad market. It doesn't only affect companies in this sector. We also talk about, spying. Have we seen the Pegasus affair? And also, it's been seen in many other events, which we haven't seen in the press, but they've been taking place, I don't know, I could dare even to say since 10, 12, 15 years approx. Normally, this type of players, they're very related to certain governments, and sometimes that they're shielded by them. And it's not me that just says this, but this is documents. So sometimes the nation state that is behind them, they have certain interests created, so they allow them, or this illegal system, to be working. They change certain business models to a way that it can benefit them. Well, thank you very much. Well, there are two questions that are directly for me, because it's a very controversial issue, but they are related to if we have to continue the idea of the European taxonomy that includes nuclear energy, and to continue the recommendations, or should we say, what would be the position to adopt, take into account nuclear energy in Spain, where 3 or 4 gigawatts will no longer be produced before 2030. So this is my personal opinion. First of all, I just say we have to separate what is an investment in new nuclear power plants, which are third-generation power plants, from the extension of the second-generation nuclear power plants. There are two completely different issues. My opinion is that, the third-generation nuclear power plant, it makes no sense whatsoever that Spain invests in them. You just have to see the experience in the UK, which they have to apply a price of, I don't know, for 35 or 90 pounds gigawatt hour, and then you have to apply to the Flammable plant in France, so it will be profitable. So obviously the French have said that when you get the first of a kind reactors, which were in the budget, and obviously we had to take into account the construction time, so an average cost of levelized cost of around 75 euros megawatt. Well, taking into account that is true, we would have to leave you know, those that are really interested in it, they really have to say they are interested. Of course, we have the Chinese who have a possibility of having a learning curve because they've got a great nuclear program, and so maybe they could reduce these prices. But at 75 euros megawatt, the difference with including renewables is so great that it makes no sense whatsoever. So what happens with extending the life of the current nuclear power plant? That depends on several things. One, if we decide, as happened in Spain or in Germany, that the perception of the nuclear accident or the risk for future generations for the management of the waste, the nuclear waste, because there's a lot of highly active waste. Well, decisions need to be made, but it's true to say that maybe with a transmutation, at the moment, well, there's been no decisions. If there would be a political decision that said it's not acceptable, well, what can we do? Which is the German case or the Spanish case? There are in other countries, there are other incentives. The French one, obviously. Nuclear energy is one of the few, or one of the sector where France has a clear competitive advantage, and whatever it costs, they will continue with their nuclear energy policy. So, not even third or fourth generation reactors. But for geopolitical reasons, they also need to have a civil technology. The United States or the UK, those countries have a geopolitical incentive to continue with their nuclear program. Because I said before, the Russian case. Russia represents, I think it's 40% of the nuclear cycle on a world level. So technology, the nuclear technology in the future, when I'm talking about the civil, is a problem. Take into account of the China too. So extending the life of the power plants, that's a completely different story. Extending lifespan has two advantages. One, you have to take into account not the cost of what has been invested, but also the cost of the new investments and also the variable cost, which is around this 20 megawatts hour with the new investments to extend the power plants 40 or 60 years, which means it's going to cost 35 euros megawatt hour. You know, this is what the European Nuclear Agency, with that price, it is competitive with renewables, even though they don't include the complementary costs, which the renewables say when we have this backup policy. But if the nuclear energy is removed sooner than expected, so from the standpoint strictly related to the environment, which is what the European Union has claimed, if we want to reduce the gas dependency, let's not put an end to the nuclear power plants. Personally, I think the nuclear policy is a complete disaster because all they're doing is increasing gas and coal consumption. And that's what Merkel did in her time. But when we're talking about the environment and a cost, I really don't think it is an alternative. So therefore, I think we have to reassess. And in fact, in the United States, 93 second-generation nuclear power plants, or I think there's 88, have a license to extend 40 or 60 years, and so, or even some 80 years. So the Americans, have they gone crazy? So this is something that is going to be open to debate, especially if we want to reduce the thermal space of a thermal gap and minimize the dependency on gas and fossil fuels. It's true to say that in 10, 15 years, we're able to have extra storage that doesn't need gas, like batteries, increase the hydroelectric that's pumped that's not going to have any effect on the thermal gap. So in 10 years' time, I think that the storage without hydrocarbons and without gas will exist. When I talk about storage, I'm talking as a backup technology for storage that isn't based on gas. Don't think it can exist. That's my personal opinion on this debate, which has been started, and I'm sure it will continue in the future. And I think that Germany said that they had to close 2 or 3 nuclear power plants before the end of this year, but I think they're still going to close them. So the Germans have paid no attention whatsoever to what the European Union has said.
¿Perdón?
10 segundos.
Sí,
para
sí, por
complementar
supuesto.
May I say something? The carbon footprint of kilowatt from nuclear plant is the lowest of all the renewable technologies, except for hydropower. So in terms of manufacturing hydrogen with low emissions, CO2 emissions, then we'll need to take into account nuclear plant. We continue. Vice Admiral? You can answer quickly if you want. Do you have questions about how the situation of the current conflict would affect the situation in the Arctic?
Ártico.
China's expansion in the Sea of China, artificial islands, etc. Maybe it could generate conflicts in the short and mid-term that could affect the choke points in the future. Thank you very much. I can answer both, right? Well, about the Arctic, in my opinion, it's clear. I'm no scientist. I don't know at what speed it is melting, but it's true that the coast of Russia, from Siberia to the Pacific, you can navigate. And Russia's done 3 things there. It has organized 2 cities that's created from the nothingness, we could say, focused on trying to give an alternative exit to gas and other materials. One of them is the city of Sabeta, where they have a liquefied gas production plant, where we have tankers that go straight to China through the Arctic. The alternative to this, what would it be? To go through the Baltic, go to Iran Bell, the English Channel, then the Atlantic, then the Suez, and then the Malacca Strait to get to China. So basically, from a strategic perspective, it's very important. And everyone probably remembers that a year and so ago, I can't remember exactly when, Russia presented a floating nuclear plant that's been taken to the Arctic, to a city called Kerkech, if I'm not wrong, which is an old gulag. So there we are seeing the extraction that we had before, also via direct transport to China. And we have to remember that China is the largest consumer of cereal, but also the largest importer, and it received the imports from Russia and the Ukraine. So once again, through the Turkish Straits, the Suez Channel, the Bab el-Mandeb Channel, and the Malacca Strait. So that way that may seem efficient from a strategic perspective for Russia and China, it could be very interesting. Before we spoke about rare lands. Well, we have rare minerals productions in China and also in the US. So there could be a return transit of other raw materials. And regarding the specific, China does 2 things. China is occupying the sea. By fact, it occupies islands and extends it with artificial construction. Then it says they are on their own and they can create exclusive zones. And then there are some of them that are militarized. Then the fishing fleet of China. China is not very present in the Chinese Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Maybe they go to the south and they occupy territories of other fleets, which is what they're doing in West Africa, for instance, from Mauritania. And then we also have an expansion that is taking place via infrastructures, as they're doing in Africa. They finance infrastructures in countries of low income that cannot pay back. For instance, what's happening in Djibouti. And so they keep their position there. And then through defense agreements, 3-4 weeks ago, they reached an agreement with the Solomon Islands, which are where the Marshall Islands are and New Guinea. And they have reached a defense agreement that allows China to defend the Solomon Islands from any rival. So that is also an area for them to grow. So yes, the answer is yes. I think that the conflict created by the expansion of China in the Chinese Sea, in the Sea of China, is going towards the south, towards the Indian Ocean, and also towards the Africa. And they've had, in fact, a special landing in Bata in Guinea. So this is something, and that's why they are doing things. Well, they're telling me that we have to finish. I'm really sorry, some questions were left unanswered, but I would really like to thank you for your participation and for the questions that you've sent us. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Claudio, and the authors of the year, Jennifer Winter, Alonso, Alberto Pillanos, represented by Carlos Machado, Vicente Cortez, and Benito Navarrete. Thank you all very much for coming today to this event, face-to-face, but also following us online. Please remember that you can download a PDF copy of the book on the Energy Club website. There's also some copies outside, and I would like to thank everyone that's made it possible for this event year after year and the different institutions that collaborate. I would also like to thank Colonel Felipe Sanchez Tapia from the Strategic Studies Center, also Igual Chacur and Diego de la Vega from Repsol, and to all of you, I hope you've enjoyed the event, and we'll see you next year. Thank you very much.